I just took a selection of court cases that were here, okay? Some of them I literally took because of the names M. Kenny, Pat Mackin, M. Kine, J. Holleran, M. Joyce and J. Curran. Any of those names sound familiar? Okay. These were cases of trespass by... Well, I obviously don't want to in any way, these were things that happened. I'm not identifying the families. Thankfully, there's so many different Hollerans, different Joyces, okay? But anyway, they were being prosecuted for trespass by cutting bog wood on the plaintiff's estate. So we think that happened up around Lochbrack, from the names, possibly. Okay?
And Guinness is like, is it?
Against Guinnesses, yeah. Another case, you've heard of the Huddy murders? Yes. The land agent was Joseph Huddy, and he's mentioned here that he was given witness that he saw persons cutting bogwood to the value of 2 shillings, okay? Now, sometimes it's very amusing that there's a record, the court reporter, and he says, a T. Carney, and in brackets, a fine-looking young man. I'm kind of going, could that be female or male? But anyway, it doesn't make any difference, all right. Joseph Huddy, a road contractor, he was prosecuting defendants. 3 pigs were wandering on and damaging Ardon Road, all right. Another, Owen Lydon was prosecuted, had to pay 1 shilling for having his pigs wandering on the public road near Ardon. And that's the Petty Sessions of 1876. The first one that I read out was 1869. Petty Sessions Games Trespass, Lord Ardelon versus James Mulroe, that he was at Ballykine in pursuit of game, having a dog, etc. His defence was, I didn't own the dog, Your Honour, sir. Okay. But they prosecuted him because he apparently had a record of the same. He also had broken down a wall. This is what they're saying or alleging. So he was fined for that one. There's a record. Why did Ardelon have such... All of the court cases virtually for his tenants were for pulling heather. He had all the areas set up as shooting lands, okay? Both the woodland and Loch Coolin itself. Hence he wanted that track, that road, that carriage road that took you from the castle itself right through the woods, and you used to be able, it would come out where the pitch is and go up by the cottages, yeah, and right up where the strip of forestry is, up onto the hill. So here he has versus Patrick Coyne, there's Charles, so that probably was his father, pulled a bag of heath in Ballyveon Mountain, the property of the complainant, okay? They're saying that the load was the value of about 3 pence. Okay, what is most tragic is one of the court cases where they needed that heather because it was a wet year, they didn't have turf to boil the potatoes. That's actually the defence was that they needed the heath for fuel, the turf being wet, so too wet to boil the potatoes. That's actually their defence. So you have what seems to be pettiness on Ardelon's part, prosecuting, but he really wanted his shoot to be known throughout the world, okay? And he had all sorts of visitors, I've highlighted them somewhere, various counts, high level, and of course his famous shoot, he got the equivalent of the Prince of Wales, George, to shoot on his Ashford estate. He gives huge details of, see if I can get some of them. Yeah, they talk about the numbers of woodcock and so on that they shot, and we're talking about major numbers like 400 in one shoot. So hundreds of woodcock in particular. I can't find that particular thing, but I have it up above, which we can discuss over the teas and coffees. The other records is where they are feting and lauding Ardalan. He purchased the village of Cong, the Cong estate. It was announced in this morning's paper in 1872, coming from the Land of the States courts, that he bought Cong village and their surround. Okay, prior to that, he had bought land from the Clements family, so they virtually disappeared with the purchase of the land from the Ardalan estate. Most of that land also was around Lough Coolan and Bin Leifa, so a lot of the land on this side ended up being owned by Lord Ardalan. A lot of people will tell you, so I'm going to try and correct this myth for once and forever. The little village up at Lough Coolan is not a famine village, okay? We have records of people living there in the 1870s, long after. Now the population was decreasing, so it's truer to say that Lord Ardalan wanted to manage the estate for shooting. So he moved or transferred families. Some of them were definitely moved into Glantraig, all right? Tonlagui, okay, there we go. And so he wanted to manage all of the hillside for shooting. So his object was to have the best shoot in Europe. Now, why did he want that, okay? Aside from, you know, these are the sort of things when you've loads of money, it was a prestige thing. He was very much the nouveau riche. He was remember Arthur Guinness, the brewing family? So he wasn't landed gentry from way back. He was only very much new on the scene. He eventually, his big object from early on was to acquire a title, which you could by both money, but also by influence. You'd get other peers and lords to nominate you. And he took the title Lord Ardalan off after the island on Lough Corrib, where you see where the actual luncheon house is. Lady Olive built a memorial to him. But that is the story of that. That's why this whole thing of the shooting rights. So he ended up probably having a gamekeeper up at Lough Coolan, because in my head, how can they manage to see people doing all these things? There was somebody up there all the time. He could afford to pay for something like that. The flip side of the coin is that the people were delighted to have him as a landlord, because he very much invested in the countryside around here. He was a fairly benevolent landlord. Okay, I've a record of him. They call them rent abatements. In other words, he didn't gather the rents in particular years, and this is up into the 1880s. We sometimes think about the famine being a one-year event and it was finished. Okay, there was famines between 1820 and 1822. There was the famine starting in the 1840s. Obviously, Black 47 is the critical year. There was famines in the 1870s, and there was famines again in the 1880s. So the records that I have is where this one there is when he purchased Cong. Imagine being able to purchase a village, okay? And then the abatement of rent was in 1879. So he actually announced that he wasn't going to collect the rent, and the people celebrated with a large bonfire and fireworks in around Cong. He gave the assurance that no person living on estates shall want for food, fuel or clothing, and a barrier. He essentially was guaranteeing that he wouldn't allow a famine to happen again. Okay. Then there's a record of where somebody was given a talk in Dublin and talking about the amount of change that Lord Ardalan, it was on a Monday night at the meeting of the Presbyterian Association in Upper Sackville Street, Dublin. He read an account of the paper and he told about how many changes that had come about since Lord Ardalan's investments, okay? And in a nutshell, he said it has changed the whole district. The village of Cong was a tatty, poor village. Let's see if I can get that sentence that they use. The town of Cong, hitherto a squalid, struggling Irish village, built in a most inconvenient site. Okay? He wanted to move the village. He wanted to rebuild a village a distance away. I think it's Strandhill, somewhere on the outskirts of Clon. I think, yeah, okay. So that's where he wanted to build. You know, some of the landlords built model villages. There's examples of that. But because of the agitation, and if you recall, in that period, we first of all had the very disturbing Mounttrasna murders, the Mount Morris murder, and we had the Huddy murders. They were all, Mount Morris was a landlord, which we lived up at Heber Hall, and Huddy was a land agent for the village area. And he was also shot while collecting rents, I believe, down around Cupbrack. But that's why I say every bit of Irish history. We've mentioned here, they're saying that if the people stopped listening to Parnell and enjoyed what Ardalan was giving them, then the whole area would prosper. Now, to a certain extent, Lord Ardalan did have village. He wanted to build a tourism industry, and in some ways that's why Clon is as famous as it is. He was going to have steamer boat traffic coming from Galway up to the Corrib. Clonbur would probably have benefited. Because there was so much agitation and there was a fear of the landlords being shot, he withdrew back to Dublin, pulled all of his investment out of the area. There was talk about him coming back. It never happened, and then at that stage you had a lot of the estates being divided up. They went to the Land Commission, and then local people began to acquire their own, usually a small holding, and be allowed to build a house on the holding that they got. So that brings us up to the kind of last 100 years. And we want to try and get a picture. As I say, the village has changed even dramatically while I've been here. And I think if we get a sense from Kay and anybody else who tells us about where there was shops. Like, for example, were there shops on the far side of the street?
No.
No? It's always residential?
Yeah, but before that,
Simon Conway's, yeah.
Lord Ivory had all that.
Who?
Lord Ivory.
Ivy. Yeah. Owned these houses?
Owned the land.
Okay.
And when he went back to Dublin, and
Lord Ivy was the brother of Lord Ardalan. Okay. Yeah.
so when he went back to Dublin, people just started building houses.
Okay.
And when he came back, these houses were here.
Yeah.
And he left it there, and that's why the road was built down at the back of the houses. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And behind the houses is the cow park. And my knowledge of that is that all the village people had the grazing of a cow. It was like a commonage. So people didn't have fridges and freezers for our young population. They had to milk the cows and only have the milk for the day in the house. And then they couldn't store it any other way. So we'll begin to move obviously these houses are new just on the corner there. Hatcho did he have a garage?
And the shop. Past the works then. Mr. Winty's shop was in between.
Mrs. Welch's house, okay.
An aunt of Thomas.
Of
Okay,
Kieran's, yeah.
okay.
The mother's sister.
Then residential houses, Kay?
Well, Hatcho works then. They had the petrol pumps and they
Yes, they were there when I was here, yeah, at first. Yeah, yeah.
And then Mrs. Guild. She had a guest house.
Right.
And with a fisherman and had a shop too. The first ice creams, Mrs. Welch and Mrs. Gill.
The first ice creams.
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good.
The ice cream would come on a fair day of all days.
So it was a rare treat.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Somebody the post office then as well.
Yeah, so this village had a chemist.
Yeah.
Oh yes, right.
And where
Right up to the 70s.
Brendan's parents' house was the doctor's house, Dr.
Hegarty.
Yes, that's up in the
Polishka.
at the
Yeah.
private house.
She has a type of lily was exhibited in one of the top flower shows in London.
The Chelsea Flower Show.
Chelsea
isn't it?
Flower Show, and that's, I think, still up in the garden, Brendan. It would be worth attempting. Look, he's
be
got as
worth
much interest in the man
Could
in
be
the
worth
moon.
a fortune. And down behind them houses,
Gardens in London.
Where, well, it was very famous and it was a big thing. She also had a daughter that raced cars, so we'd have a fair amount of people that had eventful lives.
And
Jeez, Brendan did a bit of it too.
And landed his plane down the
Say that again?
It's a boyfriend of someone of the
Hegarty's.
Yeah, he had a nice aeroplane. And there's great excitement when it landed back there in Mikey, what we call Mikey
Thanks, Phil. What year would that be, Kay, roughly? 40, 50, 60s.
World War.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you imagine the excitement of a plane coming over the village and landing, you know?
Absolutely. And thanks to Jimmy O'Donnell telling us that story after a community council meeting where we often had better community council meetings after the meeting. Exactly. And that's where the flying pig came out of.
There you go.
All right.
That's where that started from.
That was 23 years ago.
Yes. Yeah. A previous festival was called the Flying Pig. I don't know if you remember that.
Back in 1967. But back behind them houses, there was a fair green as well. And there was cricket played there back in the 1870s.
Clonbur had a cricket team.
And they played more games than anybody that year.
Yeah.
And they would have played teams in Dublin and all over.
Yeah. It was quite
Very
unusual for
English-based.
any, like Anya and Ed, cricket, but we didn't have the GAA then, okay? Well, it was just beginning, say, you know. But cricket was essentially probably encouraged by the landlords.
Yeah.
And they would often have a team themselves and they would challenge matches and so on around the place. But it survived longest in Clonbur, so it's quite unusual to a certain extent, yeah. Okay, well, we wander up the street, and again, if you're very interested on where the shops are and what they were, there was a baker's. Where was the baker's, Kay?
Up past Robert
Top of the
Kennedy's.
village, baker's. Okay, all right. Okay.